7. Psychological secrets behind why women despise single men. Carl Jung, why do some women despise men who choose to stay single? Not because they're unloving, but because they represent something society fears most freedom from: illusion. Jung understood this better than anyone. Today we're diving into the hidden psychology behind why independence triggers hatred and what it reveals about the shadow of the collective feminine. Part 1. The archetype of the lone wolf man in Jungian psychology. In Jungian psychology, the man who chooses to remain single isn't simply avoiding commitment. He embodies a deep archetypal pattern that society both fears and misunderstands. He represents the lone wolf archetype, the man who has stepped outside the collective to confront his own unconscious. To the collective psyche, especially within cultures that worship relationship norms, his existence feels like rebellion. He is not just single, he is psychologically autonomous, and that is far more threatening. Women influenced by centuries of archetypal conditioning often sense in such a man an unsettling power. Jung would call it the energy of individuation, the movement toward wholeness that breaks from herd mentality. This man doesn't seek validation through partnership status or emotional dependence. Instead, he walks into the wilderness of solitude to meet the self, the divine image within. Society, however, has long equated a man's worth with his ability to serve collective expectations, to marry, to protect, to provide. When he refuses that role, he becomes a mirror, reflecting not what people admire, but what they repress. From a Jungian point of view, the lone wolf man is an expression of the hero archetype's later stage. In youth, a man's heroism is directed outward toward conquest, approval, and desire. But as he matures, that energy turns inward. He begins to battle his own shadow, not the world's enemies. The decision to remain single is rarely conscious at first. It's the outcome of inner work that renders external attachment secondary. Jung wrote that loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. The single man feels that truth deeply. He cannot speak the language of superficial bonds anymore. Yet the feminine collective consciousness perceives his solitude as rejection. Why? Because in the unconscious mythology that shapes gender dynamics, the man has always been the pursuer, the one whose attention defines a woman's desirability. When a man withdraws from that dance, he disrupts the animus projection, the inner masculine image that every woman carries. Jung explained that this inner animus governs how a woman relates to men and to her own authority. When she meets a man who does not respond to her emotional gravity, it challenges her sense of inner control. To understand why women often react with hostility towards such men, we must explore the archetypal imbalance that modern culture sustains. In the collective psyche, the good man archetype is domesticated, emotionally available, and socially integrated. The lone man, however, evokes ancient fears of the outsider, the wanderer, the shaman figures who live beyond the reach of social control. These men answer to something higher than approval, an inner voice, what Jung called the self. Women, consciously or not, sense that they cannot possess or change such a man. He belongs to no one. In Jungian analysis, this dynamic represents a clash between Eros and Logos, the two fundamental psychic principles. Eros, the feminine principle, seeks connection, fusion, and belonging. Logos, the masculine principle, seeks order, autonomy, and meaning. When a man refuses emotional fusion and instead chooses individuation, Eros feels threatened. It interprets separation as betrayal. But from the man's perspective, it is not rejection, it is evolution. He is no longer guided by desire or external affirmation. His compass points inward toward integration. The lone wolf archetype is not anti-woman. It is anti-dependence. Jung observed that every man carries within him an anima, the feminine aspect of his soul. When he is unconscious of it, he projects it outward onto women, seeking completion through them. But when he integrates his anima, he no longer needs external confirmation. This internal marriage liberates him from the compulsive pursuit of relationships that serve the ego but starve the soul. To women still caught in projection, this is incomprehensible. They feel dismissed, not realizing that he is no longer playing the same psychological game. This man's solitude triggers the collective female shadow, the part of womanhood that resents autonomy because it has been denied it. Throughout history, women were taught that their identity is relational: mother, lover, wife. To witness a man thriving outside those structures feels like a challenge to their unconscious narrative. The hatred then is not personal. It is archetypal resentment, the unconscious protest of a collective wound that still equates love with dependency. At a deeper level, Jung would argue that the man's independence awakens envy in the feminine psyche because it mirrors the repressed animus potential within women. Every woman possesses a masculine side that seeks freedom, clarity, and purpose. Yet in societies that emphasize emotional validation and external attachment, that masculine energy is often suppressed. The independent man becomes a living symbol of what they could be if they embrace their own inner animus. Hatred therefore becomes a disguised form of longing. The lone wolf man walks the razor's edge between isolation and self-realization. His solitude is both punishment and initiation. In the collective myth, he plays the role of the hermit archetype, the one who withdraws from the world to seek truth. This withdrawal threatens the feminine unconscious because it deprives it of the mirror that validates its power. In Jungian language, he ceases to be a projection screen. Without projection, many people face their own emptiness. Women who operate from unintegrated eros often mistake this emptiness for rejection. They see the single man's indifference and interpret it as arrogance. But in truth, he is detached not because he devalues connection, but because he refuses illusion. Jung taught that when a man integrates his shadow, he loses interest in domination or validation. He doesn't seek to be adored, feared, or desired. He seeks to be whole. The absence of need in him reveals the dependence in others, and that exposure provokes resentment. The societal disdain for single men reflects the collective's resistance to individuation. A man who doesn't conform becomes a psychological threat. The collective psyche, like an organism, seeks equilibrium. Anyone who detaches from it is perceived as a disease. Women acting as carriers of social values unconsciously enforce this equilibrium through emotional criticism or shaming. What's wrong with him? Why can't he commit? These are not real questions. They are defense mechanisms. They protect the ego from confronting a deeper truth that freedom frightens those who cannot claim it. In Jung's framework, the lone wolf's journey mirrors the myth of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, defying convention to bring light into darkness. The hatred he encounters is the price of illumination. When a man transcends collective archetypes of masculinity, provider, protector, pursuer, he forces society to question its own myths. For many women, this confrontation destabilizes their relationship to the animus. They can no longer rely on men to play the script that maintains their sense of identity. Jung would interpret this as a psychic reorganization. The outer polarity between male and female collapses, forcing both to face their inner opposites. The woman must meet her animus. The man must meet his anima. Until this happens, hatred and misunderstanding will persist. The single man thus serves as a symbolic awakener, a disruptive figure who exposes unconscious dependencies. At its core, the lone wolf archetype embodies the principle of psychic sovereignty. He answers not to approval but to truth. He does not seek union out of need but out of authenticity. Jung emphasized that true relationship can only exist between two individuals who have already individuated. Otherwise, it is merely a dance of projections. The reason many women hate men who stay single is that these men refuse to participate in projection. They cannot be idealized, possessed, or defined. In the modern psyche, independence is often mistaken for coldness and solitude for bitterness. But Jung reminds us that solitude is fertile. It is the space where the self grows. The lone wolf man is not rejecting love, he is purifying it. He refuses counterfeit intimacy built on dependency and seeks instead the sacred union between consciousness and the unconscious. Until a woman has faced her own shadow and integrated her animus, she will see such a man as dangerous, not divine. His freedom reveals her chains. His calmness mirrors her inner chaos. His silence amplifies her noise. Every projection she throws at him, arrogance, fear of love, emotional unavailability, is a fragment of her own psyche seeking integration. The hatred she feels is the birth pain of her own awakening. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Thus the man who remains single becomes a psychological initiator. His presence forces confrontation with the unconscious. He is not the villain of the story, but the mirror of transformation. In the end, the reason women hate such men is not because they are unloving, but because they embody what love becomes. After illusion dies, self-possession, peace, and wholeness." Part 2. Anima and Animus. When the ideal image collapses. In Jungian psychology, every human relationship is haunted by invisible figures, the anima and the animus. They are not real people, but inner images of the opposite gender living within our psyche. The anima represents the feminine soul within a man, the animus the masculine spirit within a woman. These archetypes shape how we love, how we project, and how we suffer. They determine what we desire, and more painfully, what we cannot accept in others. When a woman meets a man who refuses to play the expected emotional role, her inner animus feels betrayed. She has unconsciously projected onto him her ideal masculine image, the one who will complete her story, validate her worth, and confirm her emotional importance. But when he remains detached, self-contained, or uninterested in dependency, the illusion collapses. And when the projection shatters, it doesn't just break the image of the man, it wounds the woman's relationship with her own inner masculine energy. Jung observed that we do not see others as they are, but as we are. Every woman carries a constellation of masculine fantasies within her, the intellectual, the protector, the passionate hero, the wise guide. These are not wrong, they are natural expressions of her animus. But when unintegrated, the animus seeks fulfillment not within but outside through men. The moment she meets a man who embodies even fragments of these inner figures, she projects the entire myth onto him. He becomes the hero, the teacher, the savior. Yet when that man chooses solitude, when he refuses the emotional scripts, she expects the projection dissolves. What remains is the raw truth: the man was never that savior. He merely reflected her unconscious longing for inner strength. The hatred she feels is not toward him, but toward the void that appears when illusion dies. The collapse of projection is a psychic death, and the ego mourns it as betrayal. This is why women often experience intense reactions toward men who stay single or emotionally detached. On the surface, it looks like disdain or anger, but underneath lies a confrontation with their unlived animus, the part of themselves that wants independence, purpose, and strength. The single man becomes a mirror of that buried potential. Instead of embracing it, the ego attacks it. Hatred becomes a defense mechanism against inner awakening. For Jung, the process of withdrawing projections is one of the most painful acts of consciousness. It demands humility, the willingness to admit that what we saw in another was our own unrecognized soul. For the woman whose animus is unintegrated, this means realizing that the traits she admired or resented in a man are her own in disguise. His detachment, his freedom, his refusal to be possessed all point to her own need to integrate her masculine strength. When a man's anima and a woman's animus remain unconscious, relationships become battlegrounds for projection. The man idealizes the woman as beauty, comfort, or salvation. She idealizes him as power, direction, or meaning. Both end up disappointed because no human can embody another's archetype completely. The single man disrupts this dynamic by stepping out of the projection game entirely. He refuses to be anyone's savior, mirror, or myth. He exists as himself, and that self-possession feels intolerable to egos addicted to projection. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When a woman encounters a man who won't absorb her projections, the transformation occurs inside her. Her ego loses its grip on the illusion that love means control or emotional fusion. The animus, once externalized, begins to awaken within. The result can feel like rage, but beneath it lies liberation. From a depth psychological standpoint, the collapse of projection is the beginning of true individuation. It's the death of fantasy and the birth of authenticity. When a woman's projected animus dissolves, she must meet that energy inside herself, her courage, her intellect, her purpose, her boundaries. She no longer depends on a man to supply what she has denied. But this inner marriage demands pain. The hatred she feels toward the single man is the shadow's resistance to integration. It is not the man himself who provokes her, it's the archetype he awakens. He embodies the unpossessable masculine, the principle of logos freed from emotional manipulation. To an unintegrated psyche, this feels like rejection. To a mature soul, it signals evolution. The more a woman matures psychologically, the more she understands that the man's freedom is not an insult, it's an invitation to her own. In Jung's framework, the animus evolves through 4 stages of development: the man of physical strength, the man of action, the man of words, and finally the man of spirit. When a woman's inner animus reaches the 4th stage, she no longer seeks external validation from men. She becomes guided by her inner authority. But before reaching this level, she often encounters inner chaos conflict between dependency and freedom. The single man existing outside her control forces this confrontation. He acts as a mirror of her developmental task. A woman whose animus is immature will perceive an independent man as cold, selfish, or emotionally unavailable. But these judgments are projections of her own disowned masculine energy, her drive, her autonomy, her focus. The more she denies these qualities within, the more she despises them in men. This dynamic explains why women can feel anger toward men who don't conform to the nurturing, emotionally accessible archetype. The hatred is the shadow's language. It screams where the soul refuses to grow. The man's independence challenges the deepest myth of romantic psychology, the belief that love must involve fusion. Jung, however, saw individuation as sacred separation, the process of becoming whole within oneself before seeking union. When a man achieves this state, he no longer seeks relationships from need. He has integrated his anima. He no longer chases her image in the external world. This inner wholeness destabilizes the collective narrative that defines intimacy as dependency. To the unawakened feminine psyche, this is incomprehensible. How can a man be content without emotional attachment? How can he find peace in solitude? Yet to the individuated man, solitude is not emptiness, it is communion with the self. The collapse of the woman's animus projection forces her to glimpse that truth. But to accept it, she must surrender the belief that her worth depends on being chosen. Jung would say that the projection of the animus is both necessary and temporary. It is how consciousness first recognizes what lies within. Every woman in her psychological evolution projects her animus onto men until she can integrate it. Hatred, therefore, is a stage of awakening, the tension between illusion and realization. The man who remains single simply refuses to play the illusion long enough for her to awaken. He withdraws, and in that withdrawal he becomes the teacher she never asked for. The collapse of projection always feels like loss. The woman feels abandoned, unseen, or diminished. But from the soul's perspective, it is initiation. The outer image dies so that the inner reality can be born. The man who walks alone is not punishing her. He is mirroring the path she must take towards self-integration. His solitude becomes a living parable that love without self-awareness is dependency, and dependency without awareness breeds resentment. In Jungian terms, the hatred toward independent men reflects the tension of opposites, the battle between eros, the need for connection, and logos, the need for truth. When the masculine within a woman has not matured, eros dominates, demanding constant fusion and emotional affirmation. But when logos awakens, she learns to balance love with individuality. The single man's detachment, therefore, is not cruelty, it's a manifestation of logos in its purest form. When a woman begins to integrate her animus, her perception of such men changes dramatically. What once felt like rejection now feels like respect. What once looked like arrogance now appears as clarity. She no longer interprets distance as disinterest, but as presence without possession. This is the alchemy of consciousness, the transformation of projection into wisdom. Jung compared individuation to the alchemical process of separating and recombining elements. The single man and the woman's animus serve as catalysts for that process. His autonomy burns through illusion. Her emotional reaction provides the heat for transformation. Together they enact a sacred conflict that forces both to evolve. But while he may seem unaffected, his solitude too is a crucible. Every projection he refuses demands that he maintain radical honesty with himself. In modern society, where relationships often serve as identity, the anima-animus dynamic is rarely understood. People confuse attraction with destiny, projection with love, and emotional validation with intimacy. The man who stays single exposes these distortions. He is not against connection, he is against unconsciousness. Jung would say he has withdrawn his own projections and therefore cannot participate in collective illusions. For women still bound to projection, this withdrawal feels like annihilation. The animus deprived of an external host turns inward, often violently. She may feel disoriented, questioning her worth or femininity. Yet this inner chaos is the necessary prelude to integration. The energy once projected outward must now be confronted internally. And in that confrontation, the woman discovers the true nature of her animus, not a man to possess, but a voice to follow. The collapse of the ideal image is not the end of love, it is its purification. Love becomes no longer about ownership, but about resonance. The woman who integrates her animus no longer seeks the unattainable man. She understands him. She sees in his solitude the mirror of her own inner strength. She respects his boundaries because she has found her own. What once provoked hatred now evokes understanding. From Jung's perspective, the individuation of both genders ultimately dissolves the polarity of hatred. The single man through his independence embodies the self's call to freedom. The woman through her inner work learns that this freedom is not a threat, but a reflection of divine wholeness. The relationship between anima and animus, once a battlefield of projection, becomes a sacred dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious. In the end, the collapse of the ideal image is the collapse of illusion itself. What remains is reality, raw, sober, liberating. The man who walks alone teaches by existence that love is not about merging but about mirroring. And the woman who learns from that mirror begins her own individuation, discovering the strength she once sought in him now lives within her. Part 3. Shadow projection. When women hate what they secretly desire. According to Jung, what we hate most in others is often a mirror of what we've repressed within ourselves. The shadow, as he called it, is not evil. It's the unacknowledged side of our psyche, the collection of instincts, drives, and truths we deny because they don't fit the image we want to project. When it comes to attraction, this principle becomes brutally honest. Sometimes hatred is not rejection, it's fascination dressed as fear. When a woman encounters a man who refuses to conform, who stands alone unmoved by validation or emotional manipulation, something deep within her stirs. She may say she dislikes him, call him arrogant, cold, or emotionally unavailable. But beneath those words lies an unspoken curiosity. Jung would say that her shadow recognizes something. It lost the instinct for sovereignty, for power, for unfiltered authenticity. What she hates is what she cannot yet integrate. Hatred in the Jungian sense is the psyche's alarm bell. It signals proximity to something meaningful. The single man, the one who stands apart from social approval, who seeks inner truth over external comfort, triggers this alarm, precisely because he embodies what collective conditioning tells women to suppress. For centuries, feminine virtue was defined as relational, caring, accommodating, nurturing. To desire freedom, solitude, or self-sufficiency was considered betrayal, And now when a man unapologetically lives those very traits, her unconscious feels both envy and threat. The psyche, unable to process that contradiction, projects. Projection is a form of self-defense. It allows the ego to externalize what it refuses to own. So the woman labels the man's independence as arrogance, his emotional discipline as coldness, his silence as rejection. Yet the emotion behind those judgments is not moral outrage, it's the ache of recognition. Deep down, she sees in him the freedom she abandoned to be loved. In Jung's view, the shadow is never entirely dark. It's raw energy waiting for consciousness. When unacknowledged, it manifests as resentment. When faced, it becomes creativity, strength, and wisdom. So when a woman despises a man who stands firm in his individuality, she's actually standing before a mirror, her own shadow looking back. She may hate him for not needing her, but beneath that hatred is a repressed longing to be that self-sufficient, that unshakable, that inwardly complete. This explains the strange emotional paradox often seen in relationships. The more independent or grounded a man is, the more he provokes both attraction and resistance. He doesn't feed the ego's hunger for validation. He doesn't play the emotional game. He doesn't collapse under guilt or emotional pressure. That makes him magnetic and intolerable at the same time. He triggers the shadow because he represents what cannot be controlled. In psychological terms, this tension between attraction and hatred is the ego's way of negotiating growth. The shadow wants integration, the ego wants stability. When confronted with an autonomous figure, the ego feels threatened, its illusion of control begins to fracture. For women, especially those conditioned to equate love with emotional fusion, this encounter feels like betrayal. Yet in truth, it's a summons from the unconscious. Find your own independence too. Jung believed that every person we meet plays a role in our individuation, the process of becoming whole. The people who disturb us the most are often our greatest teachers because they carry the traits we repress. The man who walks alone without apology becomes a catalyst for that inner awakening. His very existence forces others to confront what they've disowned. The hatred he evokes is therefore not personal, it's archetypal. He embodies the outsider, the hermit, the shaman figures who have always challenged collective norms. Women who feel provoked by him are not responding to the individual but to the archetype he activates. Their unconscious identifies him as the shadow side of the feminine psyche, the part that longs for freedom but fears the loneliness that comes with it. That fear is ancient. In the collective unconscious, womanhood has long been tied to belonging through family relationship or motherhood. The single man violates that ancient myth. He says without words that life's purpose is not found in fusion but in self-realization. To the unintegrated psyche, this feels like abandonment of love itself. To the individuated soul, it's the highest form of it. When women call such men emotionally unavailable, they often mean immune to my unconscious control. The accusation is projection, a displacement of their own discomfort with emotional dependency. The shadow feminine, as Jungian analysts call it, carries centuries of repression, the anger, ambition, and spiritual hunger denied by patriarchal conditioning. When that energy sees itself reflected in a man's freedom, it feels insulted rather than inspired. But deep within the hatred conceals desire, not romantic desire but existential desire, a longing to experience life with the same integrity, the same internal compass. The shadow whispers, "You could be that free too if you stopped fearing your own power." Yet the ego, terrified of losing its identity, turns that whisper into hostility. The single man's presence in a woman's psyche often plays out like an alchemical reaction. In alchemy, transformation begins with confrontation, with heat, chaos, and dissolution. Likewise, the confrontation with the shadow ignites a psychic fire. What was suppressed begins to surface: jealousy, insecurity, anger, admiration, all mixed into one unbearable cocktail of emotion. That discomfort is the beginning of awareness. Jung described this moment as enantiodromia, the turning of opposites. The very thing we resist becomes the doorway to transformation. A woman may start by despising the man's detachment, but over time she begins to question why it disturbs her. Why does his peace irritate me? Why does his freedom feel like rejection? In those questions, projection starts to withdraw. She begins to see that what she hated was a part of her own unrealized potential. The shadow's ultimate demand is honesty. It asks us to confront not the world, but ourselves. For women facing their projections toward men, this means recognizing how much of their emotional narrative is shaped by unconscious expectations. Society teaches that men exist to provide validation, purpose, or rescue. But when a man refuses that role, he dismantles the fantasy. The shadow reacts with rage not because it's wronged, but because it's being awakened. In depth psychology, this awakening marks the transition from dependency to autonomy. The hatred fades as integration begins. A woman who confronts her shadow learns to reclaim the power she once projected outward. She becomes capable of loving without possession, respecting without need, and connecting without control. The single man becomes not a villain but a guide, one who shows her that wholeness begins within. This dynamic also explains the collective tension in modern culture between independent men and emotionally driven narratives. The archetypal masculine, represented by clarity, logic, solitude, and purpose, has become a shadow element in a world obsessed with emotional display. The man who stays silent is seen as cold. The man who thinks deeply before speaking is accused of distance. But Jung would interpret this as society's projection of its own unintegrated chaos. The hatred towards stillness reflects fear of introspection. From a symbolic perspective, the woman's projection of hatred toward the independent man mirrors humanity's resistance to consciousness itself. Consciousness isolates. It separates us from the herd, forces us to face the void. The man who has faced that void and survived it becomes a walking reminder of that truth. His solitude becomes unbearable to those who still hide from their own depths. Jung noted that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The hatred that surfaces in the presence of the self-possessed man is part of that pain, the ego's protest against the birth of awareness. The shadow resists integration because it requires humility. It asks the woman to admit that what she despised was actually divine in disguise. When she finally accepts this, something extraordinary happens. The hatred transforms into respect. The energy once spent on judgment now fuels growth. The very traits she condemned, independence, discipline, emotional control, become qualities she develops within herself. The projection ends. Individuation begins. In this light, the single man becomes not a social outcast, but an archetypal initiator. He unconsciously serves the feminine evolution by embodying the principle of inner wholeness. His refusal to be possessed forces others to confront their own emptiness. His solitude exposes the falsehood of dependency, and his calm detachment reveals a truth society hides from, that real love can only emerge from freedom, not fear. Every woman who truly faces her shadow eventually sees this man differently, no longer as a threat, but as a mirror. She realizes that what she once hated was not his independence, it was her own denied strength. What she called arrogance was actually self-respect. What she mistook for emotional coldness was spiritual clarity. The shadow, when illuminated, turns hatred into admiration. Jung described this process as the integration of opposites, where the conscious and unconscious unite to create a new, more complete self. For women, integrating the shadow means embracing not only softness and empathy, but also power, logic, and sovereignty. For men, it means owning vulnerability and emotional intelligence. Only then can love exist without projection. Until that integration happens, the dance continues: hatred, masking, desire, resentment, hiding, admiration, judgment, concealing, longing. The shadow always seeks union, but it must first be seen. The independent man's role, therefore, is not to change or comfort, but to exist authentically, to hold the mirror steady until the reflection becomes unbearable enough to transform. That is why, in Jungian psychology, the ones we hate most are often our greatest mirrors. Hatred is just unconscious attraction stripped of awareness. And the moment we recognize ourselves in the thing we despise, the shadow loses its power and becomes part of our strength. Part 4. The Awakened Man, From Loneliness to Inner Freedom. Solitude for the awakened man is not a curse but a crucible. It's the fire through which the ego burns away its illusions. To most people, loneliness is a wound. To him, it becomes initiation. He doesn't seek isolation for comfort, but because truth demands silence. Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and for that transformation to occur, the man must walk alone. He learns that solitude is not the absence of connection, it's the presence of the self. The world taught him that love means merging, that validation is proof of worth, but the psyche teaches a harsher lesson. No union can heal a man who hasn't first reconciled with his own soul. The awakened man discovers this not through books or teachers, but through the collapse of every illusion he once depended on. He has been rejected, misunderstood, labeled as distant, cold, or arrogant. Yet beneath these projections, something else was being born: clarity. Each misunderstanding stripped away another layer of false identity. He began to see that people don't actually hate the man who is alone. They hate what his solitude reflects, the emptiness in their own dependence. Through pain, he realizes that rejection is not punishment, but purification. It forces him to turn inward to face the inner wilderness he had always avoided. That wilderness is terrifying at first. There the man meets the shadow, his unacknowledged desires, his fears of insignificance, his suppressed rage, his unlived passions. But by confronting them, he begins to integrate them. And through that integration, he becomes whole. The world's noise used to guide him what to chase, who to love, how to prove himself. Now silence becomes his compass. In solitude, he listens not to external voices, but to the quiet resonance of his own inner guide. Jung called this inner figure the self, the totality of one's being, the divine center that unites opposites. When the man aligns with the self, loneliness transforms into communion. He no longer feels separate from life. He feels rooted in it. He realizes that he was never truly alone, only disconnected from the deeper layers of his psyche. This awakening does not make him superior, it makes him free. Freedom, however, is misunderstood by those who have never tasted it. To the dependent psyche, freedom looks like detachment. To the unconscious, it looks like danger. But to the awakened man, it feels like peace. He no longer performs for love, no longer manipulates to be seen. He has stopped demanding others fill the emptiness he once feared. In Jungian terms, he has withdrawn his projections. He no longer expects women to carry his anima, the feminine part of his soul. Instead, he carries it himself. This inner marriage brings him balance, emotional depth without dependency, sensitivity without weakness, strength without domination. The awakened man is not immune to desire, he simply sees it clearly. He knows that much of what the ego calls love is actually fear disguised as longing, the fear of being unseen, the fear of facing oneself. When he recognizes this, he no longer chases love compulsively. He invites it, but from awareness, not absence. This makes him paradoxically magnetic and intimidating. His energy is still like a calm ocean whose depth cannot be measured. Some are drawn to it instinctively. Others fear it because it reveals their own inner turbulence. Jung spoke often of the individuation process, the path towards psychological wholeness. For the man, this process often begins through pain, betrayal, heartbreak, alienation. Society doesn't celebrate male solitude, it pathologizes it. Men are taught to seek meaning through achievement, possession, or romance. When these fail, they face a void they were never prepared for. The awakened man does not run from that void. He steps into it. He realizes that the void isn't the end of meaning, it's where true meaning begins. The absence of external validation becomes the presence of inner truth. Through this journey, he learns that loneliness was never the enemy. Illusion was. Loneliness stripped him of distractions so he could finally see himself. In those long nights of silence when no one was listening, he discovered something that no relationship could give him: self-acceptance. It didn't come easily. The ego fought, resisted, begged for attention. But slowly, through endurance, he learned to be with himself without fear. That is the essence of individuation, to meet your own soul and not look away. The awakened man no longer divides the world into lovers and strangers, allies and enemies. He sees everyone as mirrors, each reflecting aspects of his inner world. The woman who rejects him reveals where he still fears abandonment. The friend who envies him exposes where he still hides pride. The world becomes a living dream filled with symbols guiding him towards self-realization. Jung called this state living the symbolic life. For the awakened man, every experience becomes a dialogue with the unconscious. He reads the world like scripture written by his own soul. As he deepens, his energy shifts. He stops reacting and begins responding. He no longer measures his worth through attention or validation. His calmness, once mistaken for apathy, now radiates quiet authority. Women sense it instinctively. They feel both drawn and unsettled. The awakened man's energy does not beg, it emanates. He has no need to conquer, for he already possesses himself. His presence feels like truth, undeniable, unmoving, sacred. It disarms those still trapped in illusion, because truth always exposes falsehood. Yet awakening does not make life easier. Consciousness is a heavy crown. The awakened man often feels the burden of seeing too much, the hidden motives, the collective unconscious patterns, the masks people wear to survive. Jung warned that increased consciousness isolates. It separates the individual from collective illusions. The man accepts this solitude not as punishment but as responsibility. His role is not to preach but to embody truth, to live authentically in a world addicted to performance. In relationships, his approach changes. He no longer seeks to complete anyone or to be completed. He seeks resonance, connection between two whole beings. To him, love is not possession, it's recognition. When he meets a woman who has also integrated her shadow and her animus, the connection feels sacred, not because it fills a void, but because it mirrors wholeness. Such relationships are rare, but when they occur, they feel like two flames burning from the same eternal fire. There is passion but no dependency, intimacy but no loss of self. This is what Jung meant when he said that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. The awakened man carries a subtle sadness, a nostalgia for innocence, lost for the simpler life before awareness. Yet he wouldn't return. The cost of awakening is isolation, but the reward is authenticity. He understands that the collective lives in projection, loving illusions, hating mirrors. He has become a mirror so clean that others see themselves too clearly and often recoil. He doesn't take it personally anymore. He knows their reactions are not about him, but about their own unfinished battles. This understanding makes him compassionate but not naive. He helps without rescuing, listens without absorbing, loves without clinging. Freedom for him no longer means rebellion, it means alignment. He is no longer at war with himself. His desires, fears, instincts, and intellect move in the same direction. Jung described this as the union of opposites, the reconciliation of consciousness and the unconscious. In this state, the man becomes whole. He embodies both warrior and monk, logic and intuition, passion and peace. His presence is no longer fragmented by the search for approval. He doesn't chase meaning, he radiates it. People often ask why awakened men seem detached from the world. The truth is they are not detached, they are discerning. They see the invisible forces driving human behavior, the projections, the fear of abandonment, the endless craving for validation. They participate in life, but they do not get lost in it. They've seen the machinery of illusion and chosen not to be consumed by it. Jung compared such men to alchemists. They transform pain into wisdom, chaos into clarity. Their solitude is their laboratory, their heart, the crucible. The awakened man's greatest revelation is that peace was never outside him. The love he chased, the validation he begged for, the belonging he craved, all were reflections of an inner disconnection. When he healed, that the outer world began to mirror his inner harmony. He realized that every relationship, every rejection, every silence had been guiding him toward himself. The very pain that once broke him became his teacher. Now, when he walks alone, he doesn't feel lonely. He feels vast. His solitude vibrates with quiet power. He no longer fears being misunderstood because he no longer needs to be understood. He lives not to impress, but to express the truth of his being. And in that authenticity, he finds a peace that no relationship, no status, no external love could ever offer. Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." The awakened man lives in that awakening every day, not as a moment, but as a way of being. When a man no longer chases validation, he becomes validation itself. When he stops needing love, he becomes love. Jung called this individuation the journey of becoming whole. So if people misunderstand your solitude, let them. They only see in you what they have not yet faced in themselves. Remember, your peace will always disturb those still at war inside.